Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Wednesday, the 4th of June, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Let's go ahead and jump inside our domestic sit rep. All right, Jared, bring yourself on, please. Let's talk about this. So, the Pentagon's been looking for places to cut. They have found one. They're cutting the testing office by 74%. What's going on?
Yes, and that's 74% of personnel. So this was actually initiated last week. SecDef sent out a memo saying, hey, you guys are going to cut your personnel by 74%, and you're going to cut your budget by $300 million, which was about 80% of that. Now,
this is the Office of Director of Operational Test and Evaluation. Okay.
Yes, I was just about to say that. So yes, the ODOT, as I'll refer to it to refrain from the mouthful, had until yesterday morning to implement all of the changes. If they had anything that they've left undone, SecDef is going to step in and actually take care of it himself. The SecDef also reportedly wrote that the current operations of the office, quote, do not support operational agility or resource efficiency, affecting our ability to rapidly and effectively deploy the best systems of the warfighter. Now, the interview that was conducted with some of the higher ups of this office actually was jam-packed full of quotes. Most of them didn't like it, but one quote that did stand out from one of its critics, one of the downsizing critics, he said that we are testing exactly the same way as we did decades ago, and he joined the office in I think he said 1980. Basically, nothing has changed in 4 decades. So yes, it supports what SecDef is saying. I think ultimately what we're getting here is that this is going to end up, it's going to be focused rather than broad. Don't worry about testing, new rifles, stuff like that. We've got rifles that work. Get the F-47 out, get the Golden Dome out.
Mm-hmm. And then the F-47 that's the 5th or 6th gen fighter now?
The new 6th gen fighter that was previewed. We'll still have to see what kind of specs actually get publicized with that. I suspect a lot of it's going to be behind closed doors.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that. Let's move on here. President Trump has basically overnight doubled tariffs on steel and aluminum. So he raised those tariffs to 50%, and that's up from, I believe, 25.
Yep.
Say again?
Up from 25, yes. To go on to that, steel from the UK actually has a special carve-out. They will remain at 25% until there's a finalized deal with the UK on the 9th of July. So that may actually drop. The White House was careful to say that it's pending on that deal, not that it will raise. Mm-hmm. One other thing that the White House cited that I found interesting was that they're saying the production utilization capacity of aluminum was at 55% and heading down, and steel was at 75%. Now, what that tells me is that they're looking at it going, oh, well, we can produce a lot more. We have the capacity. We're just not using it. So the White House likely believes there's a near immediate possibility for a 33% rise in steel production and an almost doubling of aluminum production inside of the United States.
Mm-hmm. Well, Robert's out this week, but that's one question I would have is what's the likelihood that some federal court judge somewhere is going to say this is unconstitutional? By the way, if you're wondering where we get our steel from, it's not just domestically produced, but looks like we get most of our steel that's imported in terms of single country source. Canada, then Brazil, Mexico, South Korea, and Vietnam, and then some other countries as well.
There is a quick topical question. Do we have enough domestic production to actually meet capacity, or should we expect
meet demand?
Yeah. Or sorry, meet current demand, or should we expect massive increases in costs of goods and services using these materials? I think
everything I've seen so far says that at least in the near term, metal, steel, and aluminum primarily will cost more. These tariffs will, in the near term, lead to higher prices, but over the long term should lead to lower prices. All right. Thanks for that. Let's move over to the protest tracker. We are tracking 58 protests today. If you'd like to get access to all the details, you can do that over at our protest and riot tracker. Most of these protests, there's like some banner drops and some overpass protests. Most of these probably are going to have like 5, 10, maybe 20 people at most. So this is nothing like 2017, definitely nothing like 2020. But we are keeping an eye on it because we're probably one trigger event away from having many more people at these protests during the week. All right, moving on here to the global sit rep. Jared, welcome back. Let's talk about Mexican remittances. They're down 12%. This is data from April. This is year over year, April to April. And so a couple of things here. We've talked about this before. Remittances from the United States to Mexico make up about 4% of Mexican GDP. So we're looking at a 0.4% drop in Mexican GDP at a time when Mexican economists are expecting a 0.3% GDP economic growth / GDP. So it really does appear that if these remittances continue to drop, they will probably send Mexico in recession. Just looking at kind of the top level numbers. And so not looking good. Again, this represents a 0.4% drop in Mexican annualized GDP when total growth is estimated at 0.3% for the entire year. So it looks like they're at least looking at negative 0.1%. And with that, let's turn north to Canada. What's going on, Jared?
Yes. So this is coming right from the Canadian government. They're changing their immigration laws to harden the Canadian border. They're going to increase information sharing with the U.S., particularly criminal information sharing. What they called out was sexual crimes. Interesting thing to call out, but that's what they did. They are going to deny more asylum claims by making it harder to even apply for it and be eligible to have an asylum claim. And they're going to increase warrantless searches through mail and electronic service providers. Now, this is also coming from their public safety minister, and he says that this is a win for Canada, but also specifically says this is addressing irritants for the U.S. So saying this is because the U.S. is pushing us to do this.
Okay, and then by the warrantless searches, so opening up boxes or mail?
Yes, opening up boxes, mail, electronically monitoring you. They said, yes, we're going to remove the requirement for many of these warrants here.
Interesting. I guess that they intend to go after criminals, or are they going after anyone else?
I think it'll generally be cross-border and not inside of Canada, trying to address the open border issue, because the northern border is wide open.
Okay, so that might mean like getting access to electronic devices or cell phones.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Or social media of people trying to maybe come into the United States from Canada. All right, let's move on to go ahead. Yeah, let's move on to Israel.
All right. So one of the former Israeli national security advisors and also actually a critic of Netanyahu's annexation plans, his name is Yaakov Amador. He said that in regards to a U.S.-Iran nuclear deal, quote, we need to understand, we being Israel, we need to understand that if there is no good agreement, we will have no choice but to attack Iran. That's obviously quite concerning, especially because this is coming from somebody who facially opposes what Netanyahu is currently doing. So it appears that there is some kind of broad support for attacking Iran, even amongst some of Netanyahu's critics. Now, notably, this national security advisor could be attacking from the right. He is part of the Orthodox Jewish community and was only criticizing the annexation plans because it would result in international isolation.
Mm-hmm. All right. This is my understanding is this is the source of the rift, or at least one of the sources of the rift between Trump and Netanyahu is their factions of the Israeli government who want to start a war with Iran, or at least who want to strike Iran nuclear sites at a time when Trump is trying to get this nuclear peace deal with Iran and pivot towards China. So, interesting. Certainly something to watch. And then let's move on here to the South China Sea. What's the latest?
Yes, this is coming from the Japanese self-defense forces. They're saying that the Chinese actually set a personal record for themselves. Now, the Chinese have the Liaoning Carrier Strike Group out. They broke a distance record for themselves. This was all last week. Japan's just now reporting it. And you can see on the map here, the red arrow is the last reported location of this strike group. That is fairly far for for the Chinese. However, I think it's notable. I think there are several notable things here. First off, the Liaoning carrier strike group is a training strike group primarily that can be pressed into service. It is not actually intended for operational use. Mm-hmm. Now, additionally, even though this is a record for the Chinese, it is, you can see they do follow the land. They are staying relatively close to land. That can indicate a few different things. And they're also still technically within striking distance of basically all of their adversaries. I think
they're on the east side. Is that the Philippines down there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. They're likely following a continental shelf based on how far they are. The Japanese didn't plot the shelf here, which may indicate coordination with submarine, keeping them close by. Now, I'm not sure if this shows a supreme confidence in the carrier strike group's anti-ship missile defense, being that they are so close to a projected adversary here, or if they believe that there's enough coverage from their missile from their shore-based missiles that it wouldn't be an issue, or perhaps they have a severe lack of confidence in their deep sea faring, actually going out into true open ocean. You don't see those problems with Western navies. The Western navies and really Japanese navies as well, they all operate freely in wide open waters, far away from land. They don't have these issues. That's just not a limitation that's there. And that overall, being that this is the crown jewel of all modern navies, that indicates that the Chinese Navy simply is not ready to go toe to toe with anybody.
Mm-hmm. All right. Great points all around. Thanks for that, Jared. Let's move on to some of our items here. Oh, there we go. All right. Elon Musk has been extremely critical, not just of the big, beautiful bill. He said it could be big or it could be beautiful, but it can be both. And he's also been very critical over the Republicans who support it. Yesterday, he said, quote, on Twitter, he said, quote, "I'm sorry, I just can't stand it anymore. This massive, outrageous, support-filled congressional spending bill is a disgusting abomination. Shame on those who voted for it. You know you did wrong. You know it." And he also added, quote, "In November next year, we fire all politicians who betrayed the American people." And he wrote that as he seemingly promised that he's going to primary Republicans who support the bill, which is most Republicans. There are real divisions in the GOP over strategy on how to deal with not just the deficit, but also the debt. The Trump administration has been very clear. They want the debt ceiling raised by another $4 trillion. And they also support this bill that would raise both the deficit and the national debt. Realistically, we are looking at a national debt of $65 to $70 trillion in the next 10 years if this big, beautiful bill is passed by the Senate in the form that or close to the form that it was passed by the House. Supporters argue that this has to be done because expanding the debt and the deficit are needed in the near term to get these tax cuts through, which will end up growing the economy faster than the debt. And that's every Trump, Scott Bessent, Treasury Secretary, they all say, number one priority, you got to grow the economy. It's not the national debt. It's not going to be taxed out of the economy. You can't trim the budgets enough. And, that's going to leave them either, it's going to lead to obviously printing money. But in order to get the debt sustainable, they all say you've got to grow the economy, which is a fair enough point. I'll be real honest. I'm not actually sure. I see some people talking about 3% economic growth. I mean, that was part of the Bessent-Lutnick plan, the 3-3-3 plan. Get the federal budget deficit down to 3%, get inflation under 3%, and then grow the economy by 3%. Maybe. Keep your fingers crossed, frankly. Something that's interesting, and I'll give a hat tip to Conquest Theory on Twitter for pointing this out. I've talked about this book many times before. The Stakes by Michael Anton was published back in 2020. He was the Flight 93 election guy, and he wrote that article anonymously, and then he came out with this book. Michael Anton is currently over at the State Department, and he was also one of the main authors of the Project 2025 agenda. And in this book, The Stakes, he argues, he says, quote, trying to impose it, he's talking about austerity, trying to impose austerity over the vigorous objections of middle America might provoke a revolution. He continues, if politics continue as they are, then we have no chance of ever getting a handle on the debt. If we insist that be our priority now, we'll break the country. He continues, yes, it's unsustainable over the long term, but what is the long term? If it's next year or even the next decade, then we're already finished. There's no way that we can solve the problem in that short a time. If it's a generation or more, then we have a chance. But to have that chance, we have to create the political conditions for a political consensus to emerge, which means in the medium term, more debt on the road to less debt. And it seems to be the sentiment at the Trump administration. And occasionally someone will ask in the chat or ask over on the Early Warning Network platform, Mike, is the writing on the wall? Do these politicians just understand that this is an insurmountable problem, that it's not going to be solved, and therefore it makes zero sense to try to impose some austerity because we're already going to hit the wall? Is it worth the political unpopularity to enact these budget cuts, which will not make a difference in the long run? In effect, asking, why induce short-term pain, which is needless, because we're going to have long-term, big-picture strategic pain? And I think it's a fair question. I'm not actually sure that that is the calculus behind this decision. But this is something the Trump administration was talking about in the first term. And they were saying, if we don't grow our way out, there's only painful ways out of the debt. And, here we are, 2017, we're at 8 years after this, still with the same argument 8 years later. So in short, I'm not sure if that's the calculus, but Michael Anton is basically stating this case very plainly. Like, if this is not a problem we can conceivably solve, if we're going to hit the wall in 10 years, then there's no point in inducing austerity. And maybe that is the way that some people feel in Congress. Yeah, there are only painful ways out. I don't know when the last time we could have taken an easy way out, but there are no easy ways out of the debt anymore. It's only degrees of pain and when that pain starts. And I will go back, I'm not sure if this is a rhetorical flourish or an actual time frame, but Jamie Dimon said over the weekend, he's at that Reagan Economic Forum, and he said, we're going to have a bond crisis. Essentially, when foreign investors no longer want to buy long-dated bonds, we are going to have a bond crisis. He said, I don't know if it's going to be in 6 months or 6 years, but there's going to be one. Not everyone agrees with that. I saw some people who said they don't agree with that. But realistically, given what inflation is likely to do over the near term, and you think about just how much money the Fed's going to have to create over the next 30 years. If you were actually, who Ben Hunt had a really good take. He writes the Epsilon Theory blog. It's a financial investment blog. And he pointed out that there are forced buyers and unforced buyers. And a forced buyer would be households domestically or asset managers domestically. They have to invest in something. They may not put it in equities. They may not put it in real estate, but so they got to put it somewhere, and they're going to put it in treasuries. And there are also certain requirements that certain investment funds, like they have to buy a certain percentage of treasuries or hold a certain percentage of treasuries in their portfolio. So those are basically people who are forced into buying treasuries. And then you have unforced, which is a lot of foreign investors. There's no one forcing them to buy or hold treasuries. And at the point where Japanese bonds, yields on Japanese bonds are rising, there's a lot of people who are just going to go buy Japanese bonds because they're chasing yields. So at any rate, the point is, a bond crisis would happen when there's a failed auction, when there are no buyers, when the Treasury comes out and says we're going to auction off more bonds because we need to raise more money to pay the government bills, and there are no foreign buyers, and that's when you start getting cracks in the bond market. So at any rate, point is, in terms of timing, 6 months, 6 years, Jamie Dimon says he doesn't know, but it's happening. And here we have the Michael Anton argument that's saying, well, if this is just going to happen in 10 years, then why create pain if we're just going to hit the wall anyway? And I think it's a fair question. We'll go ahead and move on. All right, Jared, let's talk about this Chinese scientist caught with a fungus, which is being described as an agroterrorism weapon. The Eastern District of Michigan, the U.S. Attorney's Office there, announced charges against two Chinese citizens for smuggling this fungus called fusarium through the Michigan Metropolitan Airport. DOJ said the fungus is a potential agroterrorism weapon. According to the indictment, this fungus causes head blight in predominantly grains like wheats, oats, and corn. So we're talking about extremely important crops to the United States. And then it also produces a toxin from this fungus that can cause liver damage and reproductive defects in humans and in livestock. The DOJ said one of these two people, the scientist, was receiving Chinese government funding to study this fungus at a Chinese university. And the scientist admitted to smuggling the fungus into the United States to study it at the University of Michigan at a lab where she worked. So this fusarium is actually a naturally occurring fungus. It's caused billions of dollars in damage since the 1990s. The worst outbreak was, I think, in 1998. It caused, there were some wheat growing regions of the U.S. that had 50% reduced yields. So we're talking about potentially catastrophic blight here. And so U.S. agriculture is obviously very vulnerable to this type of attack. This used as a bioagent could make attacks appear to be naturally occurring infections. And so it would be difficult or maybe nearly impossible to pin the blame on a foreign actor or a foreign agent of sabotage. And anytime we're talking about this kind of stuff, like weaponized anything, especially from the Chinese, I go back to Unrestricted Warfare, which is this paper that was published back in the late 1990s. It's written by two Chinese PLA colonels. And this paper is about the redefinition of war from strictly military means, so conventional means, to, quote, all means whatsoever, means that involve the force of arms and means that do not involve the force of arms, means that involve military power and means that do not involve military power, means that entail casualties and means that do not entail casualties. And they say all this is required to, quote, to force the enemy to serve one's own interests. So in other words, what these Chinese colonels are saying is this method of war, the unrestricted warfare doctrine, would force the United States to pursue its own interests, which would be national survival, instead of its political or strategic goals, which in our case would be protecting Taiwan. So there's a case to be made, obviously, here. And maybe this lady, I don't know. Chinese just have a very different mindset, a very different outlook, a very non-Western view of this. If there's a door, like it's a door, it's meant to be open. They'll just open and walk through. And that's very much not a Western way of thinking. So I don't know if this was the case where this lady just said, oh, yeah, I'm going to take this fungus and do legitimate research at the University of Michigan. Maybe that's the case, but I will just tell you, everything I've seen from counterintelligence literature regarding the Chinese, any Chinese national coming into the United States could be a potential foreign agent, either on their way in or on their way out. They go back home and they get pulled into a debriefing with the Ministry of State Security agents, and they're debriefed and they're asked about what knowledge they're coming back with from the United States. So this is obviously very serious. And more than anything, this is just this book talks about using earthquakes as weapons, talks about using pandemics and cyber attacks. It mentions stock market crashes. Oh, how do you cause a stock market crash and have that be a new, quote unquote, new weapon of war? And this whole book is about how the United States has this fixed defense paradigm where we just do not look at warfare the same way they do. It's not the book's, I think, maybe like 200 pages. Okay, it's not like a incredibly complex read, but you should read it if you haven't. It is just about all the ways how you can exploit U.S. national security due to our fixed paradigm of thinking in terms of we are either at war or we are not at war. And the Chinese make no distinction between being at war and not at war. They say there's just a lot of things that we can do that do not fall into the war paradigm of the West or of the United States, but we can still use as war. And I think, obviously, fungus like this that attacks our food supply is going to be one of those things that distracts us and forces us to deal with our own self-interest, which is national survival, so that we are not pursuing our geopolitical or geostrategic or goals, which would be protecting Taiwan. So, frankly, a war, as much as there's a focus on ships and missiles and planes and whatever else in the Indo-Pacific in a war with China, I think we're missing the point entirely of unrestricted warfare, which is that we will probably see a lot of things weaponized that we don't traditionally consider weapons, but we are going to feel the effect of those things. And it's just another reason to be prepared. All right, with that, let's go ahead and move on to the next item. And that's South Korea. We mentioned yesterday morning the South Korean president, or the incoming newly elected South Korean president, has likened himself in the past to Bernie Sanders. Whenever the media says someone is quote unquote left leaning, I always maybe take that a couple steps farther. So at any rate, but this guy is a undeniably left wing president. How's that going to change the future of South Korea, Jared?
Yes. So in his inaugural speech, he actually said that he no longer wants to pursue the isolation and deterrence strategy against North Korea, which Yoon was front running, and is instead opting for a restoration of communications, which is basically a 180. At the same time, he's saying he wants to balance relations with Beijing, but somehow also maintain South Korea's current alliances, so with the United States. Now, yesterday on the show, I noted that we didn't have any record of what Lee intended to do with North Korea, since North Korea would be the primary security threat there and drive them toward us. Now that he stated this, my analysis has changed. I think in the near term, South Korea is less likely to be a reliable ally. I don't think they can be counted on to support any kind of war in the Pacific until this gets crushed from the North Korean side. Now, this is because as Lee pursues peace with North Korea and appeals to the United States' primary security threat, China, he's going to be a lot more amenable to just not taking any kind of concrete action against them. Now, there are two factors that I think that are still at play that I think ultimately will drive him toward reliability for the United States. First, appealing to China is not going to stop Chinese encroachment in the Yellow Sea. Simply isn't. The Philippines have played that game. They've lost that game for 20, 30, 40 years now. Now, second, North Korea can still view South Korea as making impermanent changes because South Korea is democratic. There's no promise to North Korea that another Yoon would not come to office in 5 years when Lee's term is up and then, reimpose isolation and deterrence. So there's no reason to think that North Korea is necessarily going to switch to, okay, let's have talks. Let's maybe consider, a bisected Korea at peace. We will have to see how Lee's diplomacy pans out, but as it stands, I don't think it's likely to achieve much, and he will ultimately have to come westward. The problem is the timeline, because we're on an 18-month timeline until a potential war in the Pacific.
Mm. Well, I think our key assumption has for years been that South Korea will not be a major player, and maybe no player at all, in the Indo-Pacific War, mainly because they have North Korea to deal with, which is going to be a major conflict.
Yeah. Generally, yes, but there's been a lot of talk recently about, hey, we can help you build ships. We have ship repair facilities. You guys can use us as a jumping off point. We have to worry about the North, but you're here already. All of that allows taking on the Chinese Northern Fleet without having to drive through 1,000 miles of open ocean.
Mm-hmm.
And this, I think that the South would, at this point, say, no, you cannot do that from our soil.
So you're saying that South Korea, in a time of war with the United States and
I think they would back
Japan, the
off.
Philippines, Taiwan, you think South Korea would not allow us to use their ship repair facilities?
Anytime in probably, I'm going to put a very soft timeline on this. In the next 6 to 12 months, if it were to kick off, I don't think South Korea would do it because President Lee here intends to get cozy with Beijing again and try to reopen negotiations or communications with North Korea. You can't be at war with North Korea's primary security guarantor if you intend to do that. Like none of that works well together. He would have to say no. But on the 18-month timeline, like maybe he would switch back to, okay, North Korea is not going to be a security threat to it, or they're going to maintain a security threat to us. The Chinese are not stopping. They're continuing to encroach in our EEZ. They're continuing to take our fish. Fine. We will have to take a hardline stance.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jared, I'm about to ask you something now that is probably outside your lane because we don't follow South Korean politics and definitely not South Korean domestic issues. But I do wonder at what point this election was so beneficial to the Chinese. I do wonder at what point if there was any Chinese influence efforts to get the populace to swing towards the left. I think Yoon, with that whole martial law thing and just like that year-long debacle, I think he probably did it to himself.
Yeah.
But
actually, it feels like a year. It was really only 6 months ago.
Yeah. Well, no, I'm saying the whole martial law, the things that were going on with our Congress. I don't remember all the details. I just remember it was bad for South Korea for a while. At any rate, I do wonder at what point China has, or to what level China has influenced the South Korean electorate, if they did or at all. Just briefly, Jared.
Thoughts? I mean, they probably did. Just everybody tries to influence everybody's elections. I don't know how well it would have swayed it, just because from what I was seeing in South Korean media, it looked like that martial law declaration was really what pushed everything toward President Lee. And President Lee, on his last run against President Yoon, only lost by less than 1%. So like he was already very close to a victory anyway, and it just pushed him over the edge. That said, I can't deny I'm hearing kind of echoes of Georgescu in Romania, where, hey, we didn't like this one. He's not allowed to participate. That was internal to Romania, but I don't know if South Korea would potentially do something similar now that he's saying, oh yeah, I want to cozy up with Beijing and North Korea.
Mm-hmm. All right. I don't know. Thanks for that, Jared. Let's go ahead and move on to our questions for the day. Here, this one. I'll just grab this. Oh, there we go. Okay. How does the team feel about the Japanese submarine forces and Navy in general when it comes to an adversary like China? I've worked with the JSDF land forces and felt they were very competent. Jared, I recall you many times saying the Japanese Navy is very formidable.
Top tier. Oh, I have never heard a bad thing about them. I can't speak to the submarine force, but I also don't think it would be that different from their surface and air forces. Honestly, the only thing that would prevent Japan, and this is my opinion here, the only thing preventing Japan from going 1-for-1 with China and winning every time is their size. That's it. Qualitatively, not even matched. Not even close.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. All right. Thanks for that. Next question. In Andrew's update yesterday, he reported California, Washington, Oregon attorney generals announced an alliance against the Trump administration. Could you talk about this? Well, I didn't. I would have to go back. You're talking about a 1600 update, I guess. I don't recall the specifics of that, but we know that these three attorneys general have been filing lawsuits jointly against the Trump administration. So I wouldn't necessarily see this as sedition, but obviously these three states are very close. I mean, we can go back to COVID when they had that during the COVID recovery, they had that whole Northwest of economic alliance thing or whatever they called it, where they said, well, these 3 states, we're going to work together for COVID economic recovery. So, yeah, I think you're right. I don't think it exactly fits the legal term of sedition. It is political warfare, which is entirely legal. I haven't seen the details of that, so I can't provide you a better question. But, certainly, I think Robert will be back on Friday, so maybe that is a topic we can delve deeper into then, because would definitely be Robert's lane. All right, will the Thursday evening event be recorded and made available? Yes. So last Thursday I did a talk about really just my logical conclusions about the end of the dollar system. I go back to that interview I did with Michael Every last month about why the dollar system will fail. And in short, it will fail because it was always known it was going to fail. It's called the Triffin dilemma. And currencies that are the world reserve, according to the Triffin theory, which I think is accurate, end in currency collapse, or they have to be modified some way. And so this is what we're going to get under the new dollar system. So I just took those conclusions and I looked at, well, what are the strategic impacts to the United States? And then what are the downstream impacts to us? And so this is what this webinar is primarily about, the first half of the webinar. So yes, it will be recorded, and yes, I will make it available to early warning folks. How do we know how the fungus was discovered? Jared, I have not seen that, other than maybe coming through customs. They open up the luggage and they're like, hey, what's all this junk in here, lady?
Yeah, I haven't seen either. I think it's entirely feasible that, yes, X-ray, but also like there are drug sniffing dogs there. What if it pinged one of those? Like there's quite a few ways it could have been found.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would guess coming through customs.
Yeah.
Right. Is there a way to estimate the damage that fungus getting out could have done? How widespread? Yeah. So Gary, I think going back to the 1990s, I want to say damages, and this is just from the naturally occurring fungus, not weaponized. I want to say like $3 to $4 billion. I could pull up the report. I was just reading through it this morning. I think they said $3 to $4 billion in agricultural damages. I'm not sure if that includes, obviously the downstream effects of you eat a piece of bread that has this fungus that grew on these kernels of wheat, and now you have liver failure. I don't even know what the problems are, but I don't know how widespread that was occurring naturally. But realistically, if we're talking about weaponized, then I could see. Well, I don't know. That's a topic for another time. So in terms of damage, up to 50% reduced yields in that bad outbreak in 1998. So maybe that's a starting point, baseline expectation. Don't hear much about modern monetary theory anymore. Not unless you follow Stephanie Kelton, which I do. I hear about it all the time. But will bond auctions technically fail if the Fed simply steps in as the buyer of last resort? Well, the Fed has already my understanding is the Fed has already started monetizing the debt, which means the Fed has stepped in to buy bonds, because the last 2 Treasury auctions were pretty weak. There was not a lot of demand. And so I think the Fed did have to step in. So this whole thing with modern monetary theory, Stephanie Kelton, she's a professor at some New York University and economics professor. She's written several books, but basically she says the debt doesn't matter. None of that. We could go up to $100 trillion in debt and it wouldn't matter. And her general theory is a country that issues its own, and I don't agree with this, by the way, but she says a country that issues its own currency cannot go bankrupt because you just print more money to pay the debt. And she says if that causes inflation to get out of hand, then you just increase taxes. Because if you print, let's just say you print $100 million and now you've got $100 million floating around in the economy, let's just say however that happens. And now she says, if you want to remove that $100 million from the economy, you just tax people $100 million and you remove that money from the economy. And she says, that's how you tamp down on inflation. That's her general argument. So Stephanie Kelton, I'm sure, will say, we'll just monetize the debt, just print money. If we have if we're running $1 trillion deficit, that's fine. We can do that indefinitely. And I've heard other people say, like, these mainstream economists, actually $1 trillion deficits are good because that means it's $1 trillion of spending. And remember, when one person spends, every time one person spends, another person is getting income. Okay, in general, that's how that works. And so when you reduce spending, you reduce income. This is the whole Ray Dalio argument about why deleveraging is so bad. So these economists say, actually, deficit spending is good because we're putting money into the economy and we're paying people and we're producing income and we're producing economic growth. This is the problem. If you could just tax and spend your way into economic growth, every country in the world, this is not rocket science, every central bank in the world could achieve this. But they're not achieving this, which leads me to believe this is not realistic, and it's not. So in terms of would you have a failed bond auction, I mean, define what failure is. I think investors would look at that and say there are no big buyers other than the Fed for U.S. debt. That's a red flag. And, it probably begin at some point, I would expect that to cause a confidence collapse in treasuries. You would ask yourself, why is there no foreign demand for treasuries? Why is it all being bought up by these banks, which is basically just a backdoor? That's how the Fed buys treasuries. They don't buy it directly from the treasury. They print the money, they give it to the banks. The banks go out and buy the treasuries, and then they transfer that back to the Fed. So the Fed balance sheet. So I think that would cause a massive confidence crisis. One of those the cracks in the bond market that JP Morgan's been talking about. All right, unrestricted warfare below the threshold of kinetic actions, fungus, cyber, fentanyl, etc., is still warfare. 100%. Thoughts on appropriateness of escalatory retaliation above that threshold? Well, here's the problem. The Chinese excel at gray zone warfare. Okay, so we look at this as a spectrum. We have cooperation. So this is what we do with allies. We can even have cooperation with our adversaries, like trade cooperation and security cooperation. And then you get into a period of competition. So this is where we are with China in competition. And then beyond that, you have crisis, and then you have armed conflict. So cooperation, competition, crisis, conflict. The gray zone occurs between crisis and conflict. So if conflict is a 3, China excels at operating at like a 2.5 or 2.75. So this fentanyl stuff, Chinese pushing fentanyl into the United States, it absolutely is warfare. It's not armed conflict. It is beneath the threshold of armed conflict or beneath the threshold of conventional war. We call it the gray zone because we're not shooting war, but we're definitely not at peace. So there's a gray zone between the white of peace and the black of war. And so the response is, well, what can the United States do in the gray zone to, as you say, retaliate? And that's a great question. Historically, we do not excel at gray zone conflict because we excel at armed conflict. So the other issue is, I think we have been attempting to, not exactly, you would call this gray zone warfare, economic coercion, but I think that the tariffs on China are obviously aimed at hurting the economy. There's a guy named Bronco something. I think he's another economist, but basically he was saying, well, if these Trump tariffs are aimed at harming China, everyone is focused on, how it harms the U.S. economy. That's bad. We have to stop this. It's hurting ourselves. But he said, if you reduce Chinese GDP by 2%, and in return, your own GDP is reduced by 1%. So we're hitting them for 2 and we're being hit for 1. That's a net win. We're causing more damage to the Chinese that are less able to afford reduced GDP. And we are better at absorbing some loss of GDP. If we lost 1%, I think technically we would probably still be growing. I don't think 1% would push us into recession. I mean, the Atlanta Fed GDP now, or the Yeah, the GDP now was at 3.8% last week. It's up over 4% now. Not that I think that's entirely accurate, but that's a big rebound. Consumer confidence is up. May's numbers for consumer confidence were above consensus. So I think a lot has changed in the economy. At any rate, so to answer the question, I don't know. We could probably sit down and make a list. I can't tell you off the top of my head, other than to say, obviously the tariffs. We go back to what Scott Besson said back in April or May of this year. He said, or maybe even March, he said, the Chinese are in a period of economic recession, or maybe even a depression, deflationary. They're trying to export their way out. He literally said, we cannot allow them to do this. So I think that's what the tariffs were aimed at. The tariff wall, if you want to go along with the argument that the Trump administration in these trade deals is trying to negotiate these foreign countries into adopting their own tariffs on Chinese goods. It's what we call the tariff wall. Then that is economic. That's gray zone warfare in the economic sphere. And so I think that's probably a good example of what we've been trying to do. Hope that answers your question. Oh, sorry, Jared, you said you had something.
Yes. So when it comes, you've mentioned plenty of times, China's great at 2.75. 100% agree with that. I think the fungus stuff is over a 3. And the reason I say that is you're talking about biological warfare there. That is absolutely an act of warfare that's recognized. And I think that would tip it over into open warfare, which is America's playing field. Let's not kid ourselves. We criticize the military here a lot, but it's because they're not as good as they were, and they are still the best. Biological warfare, I will have to double check. I think it is explicitly I think it explicitly is a red line for nuclear doctrine. Like, it is not something to be messed around with. And there are tons of preparations inside of the military for biological warfare. You run it through the Navy all the time, but doing it homeland or home side, nobody's really prepared for that. And that would, I would not be shocked to see us go to 100 for that. That's biological warfare is nothing to mess around with, and destroying half of our crops while letting the remaining 50% sometimes giving you liver failure and destroying your kids. Mm-hmm. Okay. No, that's warfare, open warfare.
Listen, I don't disagree with you, Jared. The problem is one of attribution. If you have, it's just like a food production facility catching fire or a steel plant exploding. That stuff happens all the time. Well, not all the time. It's not uncommon for that to just be a naturally occurring thing. And the problem is attribution. So the question is, could China do this beneath the threshold of observation? And the answer is probably yes, they could. So unless we had some other way to prove that, through like signals intercepts or, some other forms of intelligence gathering means, we could determine that China's doing this deliberately, catching people. It's just like the arson, I was talking to a fire chief who retired out of California. He now lives in Texas. And he said, anytime you have a wildfire and then you see like more than 2 or 3 other fires start in the same general area, he said, that's always going to be arson. There's someone starting fires. And so at any rate, we know that happened during the LA fires. Who is responsible for it? I don't know, maybe individual actors. I'm not saying it was nation state backed, but, and then, several years ago, we had this really bad wildfires all across the West. And there was a lot of speculate. Is this Al Qaeda? Like, is this some terror group setting fires? Is this their new MO? So again, at any rate, bottom point is if you can't attribute it, it's going to be very difficult. It's going to be impossible to respond with armed conflict or declaration of war if there's probably not some proof there. But fair point. Biological warfare is actual warfare. I would look at this more. I would look at very selective. I would look at this more as sabotage than a declaration of war. Let's be honest. I think China's obviously already at war with us. Not like a declared shooting war, but they clearly are. Yeah. And so I would look at almost that as like acts of sabotage as opposed to active deliberate armed conflict. at any rate.
Everyone's blasé about the fentanyl crisis at this point, but China's never, like, they deny it to the diplomats, but in their own writings, they don't even pretend that this is not a response for their own opioid crisis. They just say it is. Like, that's probably why they use opioids, is they went through their own opium wars. They were addicted to opium. Yes, the Chinese make no bones about saying, yeah, we are going to conduct a form of warfare on you, just internally.
We'll go back and read Unrestricted Warfare. We don't want to fall into the trap of reading that book and then thinking about foreign sabotage on U.S. soil, falling into the trap of every accident is sabotage.
Yeah.
Some accidents are. Some accidents will be. There's a thing that in the human brain called confirmation bias. And we tend to believe things when we're looking for them to be true. So I would just also caution, we have to be realistic about the situation that we're in, be realistic about gray zone warfare, but we cannot fall into the trap. We have to be very discerning about what we label. This is likely sabotage, or this is just an accident because accidents happen.
I do wonder, I have one other thought on this. The U.S. government is going to sound crazy to a lot of people. It is filled with smart people. They do think about this kind of thing. So how do you mitigate? How do you make sure you can positively attribute or not attribute an action to a state actor, particularly one that operates in the gray zone like China? I would not be shocked to find that the U.S. government takes additional actions to make that far clearer, maybe additional surveillance. I think the student visa policy that was put out is certainly attributable to that end. I mean, for goodness sake, these were students. But yes, they're scientists, but they're operating through a university. Their student visas were on par to be revoked. So that's probably what we're seeing with the U.S. government's actions against China is, okay, get as many of them out as possible. That way surveillance is easy. That way, if there is a spill, or if it is actually pushed out intentionally, we can figure it out quickly and respond appropriately.
I know I saw a lot of people saying, you can't ban foreign students from Harvard. Who's going to build our technology? As if the United States had no technology before mass immigration, number one. But number two, this is not the death of American technology and innovation. This is a blow to Chinese espionage being run, and not just espionage, but influence operations also being run through Harvard. Obviously, see, you remember when I'm pretty sure they passed this into law. They went back through and they restricted access of the Confucius Institute to all these universities across the country, and these were just cultural exchanges. China does this all over the world, but these were just places where everyday students could learn about how wonderful Chinese culture is, and they can read about our 6,000-year history or whatever they say, which is also a lie. And and it's like a cultural exchange. Right? Come eat some Chinese food, learn to say ni hao, and it wasn't that at all. It was absolutely an influence and eventual espionage recruiting operation. And so with those restricted, China has to continue to find ways to continue to prosecute that mission if it's not being run through Confucius Institute. At any rate, let's go ahead and move on. I think we do have a few other questions. Could they be ramping things up to do the pending actions against student visas? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, I'm not sure who they is in this. Is that China or the U.S. taking actions against students with student visas?
I'm not sure, but it's every few days or every week or so, the Department of Justice has some new indictment against Chinese nationals inside the United States, or even sometimes American citizens, or trying to transfer technology or sensitive data or other things to to China from the United States. So, all right.
Okay. This is the last question.
Okay. All right. Well, everyone, thanks so much for watching. That's going to do it for today's morning briefing. By the way, I think tomorrow we will start to add beta testers to the new intelligence platform. You're going to love it. It's fantastic. all the features that you like about our current early warning platform are over there, and it's going to enable us to do a lot more that we can't do during our on our regular platform. So we will be beta testing, and then here, like the next week or two, we'll start announcing we're going to migrate everyone over. It's going to be fantastic. You're going to love it. It's the big, beautiful intelligence platform. Big and beautiful. Thanks for watching today's briefing. We'll be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on this show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.